Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to this week's 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum of Dublin. Now, our guest this week is Harriet Wheelock, who's the Keeper of Collections with the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland. Harriet, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Delighted. So to everyone who's with us this evening, as we go through the evening, if you've got any thoughts or questions, please do type them in and we will take time to go through them with Harriet. But I've got quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to jump straight in. Harriet, just before we get into the details, just for anyone who's not coming from the medical field themselves, would you just explain a little bit about the mission of the Royal College of Physicians to us, please?
Yeah, so the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland is a postgraduate training body. So we train the junior doctors. So once medical students have completed their medical degree, they spend a year as an intern doctor in the hospitals, and then they choose to do specialist training either in surgery or in one of the physician specialties. And we look after the physician ones, so general internal medicine, pathology, obs and gynae, pediatrics, public health, and occupational medicine. So we train, so the junior doctors that you see and meet in the hospitals would be our trainees. So they have their placements in the hospital, they do training with us, and as part of that, they do our membership exam to become members of the college. And then from that, they can go on to become fellows of the college, which fellowship is by nomination. So it tends to be at consultant level, and it's kind of a recognition of your position it's kind of as a leader of the profession. So as well as doing the training, we're also, a kind of an association for doctors as well. So we kind of, we'd have membership activities and things like that.
Okay, perfect. That just kind of helps to kind of contextualize it in my own head. Yeah. And then, so if that's what it is today, bring me right back to the foundations of the college and just tell me a little bit about kind of the key milestones in building and establishing it.
Yeah. So the college was founded in 1654 and we were founded by John Stern. So Stern was the first person appointed as Professor of Medicine in Trinity College. And when he was appointed Professor of Medicine, there was no medical school, so he had nowhere to teach. And he said to Trinity College that he would restore a building that the college owned that was in need of some repair if he could use it as a place to teach and a place for physicians to meet. And he was also planning to live there. The building was called Trinity Hall. It's roughly where O'Neill's on Suffolk Street is now. So a little bit outside of the main campus of Trinity. And that was an intentional decision because Stern was intending to teach anatomy to his students, and the teaching of anatomy, and particularly dissection, was still quite controversial. So he wanted to keep his medical students away from the arts students. And so he founded the Fraternity of Physicians in 1654, and then in 1667, the fraternity was granted a royal charter, which set it up as the College of Physicians of Trinity Hall. And under that charter, if you wanted to practice medicine in Dublin or within 7 miles of the city, you had to apply to the college for a license.
Okay.
In 1692, we were granted a second royal charter, kind of as a result of the Jacobite Rising and then the Williamite Wars. The college had sort of slightly it wasn't really fulfilling the terms of its original charter. So a second charter was granted in 1692, and that extended the licensing power to the whole island of Ireland. It gave the college to the right to license midwives and also inspect apothecaries. And that 1692 charter is still the governing charter of the college today.
Okay.
Most of it is not still in force, but some of it is. So we are still governed by the charter. I think I'm probably one of the few people who've actually read it. And so just to make sure that we're not breaking the rules that were set down then. But in 1692, the new charter, it broke the official link between Trinity and the College of Physicians, and we were set up as a separate body. So we had to move out of Trinity Hall. But the college didn't actually move in anywhere else. And for the next about 100 years, they didn't have a permanent home. So they held their meetings in the houses of the professors, sometimes in Trinity College, sometimes in sort of the hospitals and medical buildings around Dublin. And then in 1812, when Patrick Dunn's Hospital opened on Grand Canal Street, the college were given a room in that building where they could hold their meetings and also store their library, which appears to have been sort of perambulating around for 100 years. And then the physicians didn't really like Patrick Dunn's Hospital. They felt it was a bit far from the city centre, so it wasn't very convenient, and they didn't like sharing the entrance with the poor of Dublin who were coming in for their treatment. And they said they wanted a new building somewhere in the city centre, and they were very jealous of College of Surgeons who just built their lovely building on Stephen's Green. So in 1860, the Kildare Street Club who had just built the red brick building at the bottom of Kildare Street that's now Alliance Française in the National Library. They were moving from the middle of Kildare Street to that new building, and they offered their old building to the college.
You were just talking about your building there, and you're in quite an unusual circumstance in that I would imagine in that part of the city, you're one of the few organizations who moved into and have continued to be housed within the building. And so looking at your building as an artifact, how much do we actually know about its evolution over time?
So we do know quite a lot. So there's a lot of material in the archive about the building. From the college bought a building that they were expecting to move into, but there was a fire on the site and the building was destroyed, which left the college with a prime city centre location and a lot of money from the insurance. We did very well out of it. And they had to decide what kind of building they wanted, which I don't think they hadn't really considered beforehand. So they set up a building committee, very fond of committees, and we have the minutes of that in which they discussed what they wanted, and they actually held a competition for architects. They put out a call, they said the rooms they wanted, they specified how much it was to cost, and they said the style was to be anything but Gothic. It's the only style stipulation, and 6 architects submitted designs, and the designs were all displayed, like the plans and things were all displayed in Patrick Dunn's Hospital, and then the college chose the design they liked best, and it was William Murray Jr. who's the architect. So we have his original designs, we have his letter he wrote to the college explaining why he thought it was a good design and why it was the right design for them. And there were a few changes made during the construction phase, but not very many. And then the college moved in 1864. You'll see in the building everywhere is the date 1863. It's in the plasterwork, it's in the stained glass. Building took a little bit longer than expected. At the back of the site was a racquet court, which had belonged to the Kildare Street Club. And initially the college left that alone, but in the 1870s they decided to extend their building and they brought the racquet court into the main structure. They've built a linked corridor and redid the inside to make it look like the rest of the building. And essentially, there have been very few changes since. The basement levels have been altered because they're not as sort of elaborate. But the interior is pretty much the same. In the early 2000s, there was a big refurbishment and they put in disability access. But other than that, there's been very little change. But the biggest change that I think perhaps most people don't realize is that the front of the building is not the original one. Okay. So in the 1950s, the original facade was made of sandstone, and in the 1950s they discovered that the sandstone front was coming detached from the bricks behind it, and there was a danger that the whole facade was going to collapse into Kildare Street, and it had to be removed and replaced. And they did a like-for-like replacement, so it looks exactly the same, but it's actually a much newer building. And part of the original portico that was taken down is, I think it's in Woodbrook Golf Course. It's sort of displayed in the gardens as a feature.
Oh.
I believe it's still there. I've never been to see it, but
gosh, well, what a necessary piece of work by the sounds of it, though. And I was doing a little bit of research before today, just in prep for this conversation. And one fact, if it's true, was quite a kind of progressive, admirable thing. I came across, is it right that the College of Physicians was the first medical school across Ireland and the UK that actually accepted women?
Yeah, it was. So in the 1860s, quite a lot of women, particularly in England and Scotland, were campaigning for access to the medical profession. So at that stage, to get onto the medical register, you had to have a degree from a university or from one of the licensing bodies. But the universities wouldn't allow women. They would allow women to study, but not take the degree in the UK. So a lot of these women went abroad. So they studied in Zurich, was a place that admitted women. So they had a medical degree, but because it wasn't a British one, it wasn't recognised by the General Medical Council. And because it wasn't recognised by the General Medical Council, they couldn't register, so they couldn't practice. So there's a big campaign, and Sophia Jex-Blake is probably the best known of the women who campaigned for this. They're often known as the Edinburgh Seven, who were the first 7 women who studied in Edinburgh but didn't get their degrees. And under pressure in 1872, the British government passed what was called the Enabling Act, which allowed any of the 17 licensing bodies for medicine, or examining bodies, to accept foreign university degrees as a prerequisite for sitting their exams. So they didn't specifically say it was to allow women to do it, but by doing that, they allowed women to do it because they could have the foreign degrees. And the College of Physicians in Ireland was the first place to take advantage of that enabling act. So in January 1873, Eliza Dunbar came to Ireland. She was from, I think she's from London. She came to Ireland, she'd studied in Zurich, she presented her degrees, the college accepted them, she sat her exams and passed. And so she was the first woman after the Enabling Act to be allowed onto the medical register, and about the first, I think maybe sort of 15 or 20 women to qualify in the British Isles qualified through the college. Then the other licensing bodies opened up to women as well, and they didn't have to come to Ireland, so the numbers trailed off, but we were the first place. And I think it's something we probably don't celebrate enough.
And do we know why we were the first? What was our motive?
No, so Dr. Laura Kelly, who did her PhD on the topic in UCD, she was in UCD, had a look at, that's her area that she did her PhD on, and she suggested a couple of things. One was Ireland was quite progressive about education of women anyway at the time, so it wasn't a complete outlier. There were also a couple of very progressive members of the college, fellows of the college, who could make the decisions. One of them, as well as being a doctor, was also a Protestant clergyman, and he very much believed that if it was a woman's mission to be a physician, they shouldn't sort of get in the way. So he was kind of coming from that view. And there was also a question of, you paid to sit our exams, so there was money advantage. And also because most of the early women were coming from England or Scotland, they weren't intended to practice in Ireland, so they weren't going to be setting up in competition to the fellows. They were going to come here, pay to sit their exam, and go back to the UK. So, that might have been a reason. And then also the president of the college at the time, who sort of was the one who signed off on letting the women sit there, had 9 daughters, which I've always suspected.
I would dare say that informed his
may have had something to do with his decision making.
Absolutely. And then, like, when we look at, I guess, the time span that the college has existed within, I can't help but wonder, religion must have factored in to the life cycle of the college as well. Yeah, so the college we were founded in 1654, so we were actually founded during the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. The original oaths that you had to take to become a fellow did, as with all government oaths, included the oath against transubstantiation, so prevented Catholics from becoming fellows. Very early on in the 1670s, the college actually nominated a Catholic doctor to be their president, and at that stage, Trinity College had the final say on who was the college president, and Trinity College refused the nomination. They said it was to do with irregularities in the paperwork, but it was generally assumed to be that it was because he was a Catholic. After 1692, you couldn't be a fellow of the college and Catholic until Catholic emancipation in the 18th century. So our first Catholic president was Dominic Corrigan, who was president in 1659. Sorry, 1859. So it did take, 1859. It did take quite a long time for that to come through. But right into the 1960s, because the college was seen as having a link with Trinity, it was seen as an Anglo-Irish Protestant institution right into the 1960s. And a lot of Catholic doctors never joined. They didn't have to. They didn't become members, and they didn't become fellows. And by the 60s, it was a real problem for the college. And they took steps to kind of really try really hard to break down those barriers and encourage the Catholic consultants who'd never joined to become part of the college. And now it's, there hasn't been any prevention of Catholics joining the college for over 200 years, but it did take quite a long time for that to break down. So it was an issue. Okay, but it was a kind of a long one, moment of progress. And then, like, the archive within the college, like, that was established back in the mid 1600s. So I guess my question is twofold. It's, what was the mission, or what was the purpose when the archive was being set up, or who was the person that made the decision? And you've got what I think is one of the most intriguing job titles I've ever heard, the Keeper of Collections. So, I'd love to know, what was the mission for which the archive was set up, and what does your own work and role with the college entail? So I'm not at the college. I don't know whether they kind of intended to set up an archive. The early fellows knew about the importance of recording their history.
So Patrick Dunn, who was one of our very early presidents, gave the college a book, and it's inscribed from him saying, this is a gift of Patrick Dunn, and it's to record the important records of the college in. And we still have that, and it does contain, the copy of the charter is in there, all the ordinances made by the college are in there, all the presidents and fellows are in there. So they were obviously intending to record their own history. And it is quite, the archive is quite institutional. It's the history of the college and the doctors. So although it is about medicine, it's not about the patient experience, I guess. Certainly up into the 20th century. Once the college moved into the building on Kildare Street in the 1860s, they had a lot more space, not only to keep more of their own records, but they also sort of started collecting other material relating to the history of medicine. And particularly in the early 20th century, Dr. Kirkpatrick, who was a registrar of the college for nearly 50 years, he wrote lots on the history of medicine. He was interested in the history of his profession, and he intentionally went out and collected material. And so he, asked other doctors to give him things. He collected things from hospitals. He bought stuff and gave it to the college. So it's largely due to him, a lot of the collecting we have. In the 1980s, when a lot of the hospitals in Dublin closed, the physicians there gave the records to the College of Physicians to keep them safe. So we have material from those as well. So I'm not sure they ever really intended to set up an archive. It just sort of happened. And then so the college has had a library since 1713. That was intended to set up. Dunn left his library to the college, but it was a library for the fellows, so it wasn't open to the public. But by 2000, there was a lot of interest from academics in the history of medicine. Lots of people were contacting the college saying, could they come and see the library? Could they come and see the archive? The archive wasn't catalogued. It was very difficult to access. So the college applied to the Wellcome Trust in London for funding to catalogue the archives. And I started on that funded project. So I was in for a 2-year project to catalogue the archive for the first time and make it accessible to researchers. And then I've stayed ever since. I just refused to leave to keep me on. And then because there had always been a librarian in the college, and there still was when I started. When he retired, the college offered me the title of librarian. And I'm not a trained librarian, I'm a trained archivist, and I didn't really want that title. I didn't feel it was kind of appropriate for what I did. So like, what do you want to be called? So after a lot of negotiation, we settled on Keeper of Collections, which is a nice broad title. And I think it goes with kind of the age of the college and that sort of, a sense of history. And it's more than just a library or an archive. There's lots of objects in the collections as well. It's broader than just books and paper, I guess.
It is truly a collection. It's wonderful. And it is, your collection is quite a unique position relative to a number of the collections across the city, in that you have two audiences. You are, engaging with the wider public, the general audience, the researcher, but also the doctors and those working and living in the professional field. And so I'd love to chat a little bit about some of the pieces within your collection. And when myself and yourself caught up earlier this week, you described your kind of, the blockbuster piece within the collection. And listen, every collection has one. That yours is Napoleon's toothbrush.
We have Napoleon's toothbrush. I have a love-hate relationship with it. We have people who just come to see it and then are slightly disappointed because it's quite small. But it's essentially after the Battle of Waterloo, when Napoleon was on the Bellefonte, which was the ship that took him to St. Helena, there was an Irish naval surgeon, Barry O'Mara, on the ship. O'Mara spoke French, which meant that he and Napoleon could talk to each other. They got on very well, and Napoleon requested that O'Mara would be his physician while he was in captivity.
Okay.
And the British Navy agreed, although they wanted O'Mara to spy on Napoleon, and O'Mara said, "I will be Napoleon's doctor, but I'm not going to spy on him. I'll be his doctor." And they spent several years together on St. Helena, and they got on very well. And Napoleon gave O'Mara several gifts during that time. It's not entirely clear if he actually gave him the toothbrush or that came later, but there's certainly a snuff box that we have that Napoleon gave to O'Mara. And we also have the lancet, which is essentially a small knife that O'Mara used to bleed Napoleon. Bleeding was a very common treatment at the time. O'Mara was very outspoken in his criticism of the conditions that Napoleon were being kept in. He complained to the British government, and he didn't quite go as far as saying they were intentionally making Napoleon ill, but he definitely said, the way he's being kept is not helping his health, whether it was intentional or not, and he wrote letters to the paper about this, and the British government got extremely annoyed with him, and he was eventually removed from his position as physician. He was kicked out of the Navy, and the British government tried to stop him practicing as a doctor. O'Mara went back to London, where he set up as a dentist. He displayed Napoleon's wisdom tooth, which he'd removed in his shop window, with a letter from Napoleon saying, great guy, great dentist, go and have your teeth done here. And then when Napoleon died, O'Mara published an account of his time on St. Helena with Napoleon, and Napoleon had told him to keep a diary. And when O'Mara asked why, Napoleon said, you can publish it after I've died and it will make your fortune. And it did. It was an international bestseller. It was translated into lots of language in several editions, and O'Mara ended up extremely wealthy as a result of his famous patient. So the items that we have were collected by another Irish surgeon in the 1920s, and then they were given to the college in the 1930s. So they've been there ever since.
What a singular experience. That's incredible. It's I love when you get the ability to kind of deep dive into an artifact and learn the true backstory to it. Because one thing I was really curious about is seeing that Dr. Kathleen Lynn, you actually have some of her diaries as well. Like, tell us a little bit about her and why that's such a significant thing.
So Lynn was the chief medical officer in the 1916 Rising, is probably what she's best known for. She was born in Mayo. Her father was I think he was a Protestant. I think he was of some form of Protestantism priest in Mayo, and she grew up there. She attended school in Dublin and then went on to study medicine. She had quite a lot of trouble on graduating. She was sort of in the sort of second generation of female doctors to come through, and it was still quite difficult for women to get positions in hospitals, partly because a lot of the hospitals, the junior positions, you'd be a resident in the hospital, and they didn't have dormitories for women to live in. She was refused one job because there was literally nowhere for her to sleep in the hospital. So she she was involved in the lockout in 1913. She was in the soup kitchens working for them. She got to know James Connolly, who then asked her to teach first aid to the Irish Republican Army, and then she was the chief medical officer in 1916. She was arrested. She was in City Hall, where she was second. City Hall. Yeah, she was City Hall, where she was second in command, and eventually took over when Sean Connolly was shot. And apparently had to insist on being arrested. So when the British troops got in, they thought she was a nice middle-class woman who'd just got mixed up in this in passing, and she was there going, no, I'm in charge, please arrest me. She was in Mountjoy in Kilmainham and was eventually released. They sent her to the UK sort of on a kind of day release scheme to work with another doctor over there. But when she heard her sister was ill, she just came back to Ireland in defiance of the rules. And then in 1919 with Madeleine French Mullen, who she lived with, and then a couple of other female doctors, she set up St Alton's Hospital, which was on Charmont Street in Dublin, and it was aimed at sort of infants between sort of 6 months and about 5 or 6 years, who there was a lot of the patients they had there was malnourishment. It was a very poor area of Dublin. There wasn't enough food. They were very malnourished. TB, of course, was a big issue. So they set up St Alton's Hospital to kind of treat these. But as well as being a hospital, it was quite a lot about kind of educating mothers and providing supports that just weren't there. And they had a policy of positive discrimination, that they only appointed female doctors, because obviously she had suffered from not being able to get appointments before. So Lynn remained working in St Alton's for the rest of her life until she died in the 1950s. When St Alton's closed in the 1980s as part of the reorganisation of hospitals in Dublin, the records were given to the College of Physicians. The chief physician there was a fellow of the college, and she gave them to the college for safekeeping. And about 5 years later, we were contacted by Kathleen Lynn's great nephew, who had her personal diaries, and said he would like to give them to the college because he wanted them to be with the records of her hospital, which is lovely. So we have these 4 bound volumes of her diaries, and they're really unusual. Instead of each double page spread is a day, so the 1st of April, and then the first line is for 1916, the next line is the 1st of April 1917, then 1918, then 1919. It's a really unusual format. She unfortunately has doctor's handwriting, which is terrible, and they are very difficult to read. We have a transcript of them for researchers because the originals are pretty much impossible to read, but they start on Easter Monday 1916. That is the first entry, and it just starts Easter Monday, Revolution, and then she just launches into her story.
That's amazing though, because it makes you wonder if she realized, okay, this is a moment in history that needs to be recorded.
Yeah, the early entries, I think, are copied in. So as well as the diaries, we have some scraps of paper, which seem to be the original Easter week entries that she's later copied into these volumes and then kept them. But she keeps the diaries from 1916. She keeps them pretty much every day until her death. Like the transcript of them, I think it's nearly 1 million words. Like, it's a huge amount of information. And she sort of drops into conversation. She knows everybody.
An amazing resource though, as like a
Yeah.
researcher, to have access to something like that in hindsight.
Yeah.
It's incredible. And
so we've put the entries from 1916 transcribed and available on our website for the first 3 weeks, so you can read those online. But otherwise, the transcript is so huge you have to come in and see it. But yeah, it is available for anyone to read. We are hoping to publish a version of it, but there's quite a lot of editing that needs to be done.
I would dare say probably 250,000 words worth. But so then I guess I'm kind of curious. So if I was a doctor, like what are the 1 or 2 pieces in your archive that medical professionals are most regularly curious to see or to hear or to read?
Yeah, it depends a bit on the specialty. So William Stokes, who's if you've been to any Dublin hospital, there's nearly always a Stokes ward in there, and they're all named after William Stokes. So he was a president of the college in the 1840s. But in 1825, as a newly qualified, he'd just come out of university. He wrote one of the first books in English on the use of the stethoscope, which had just been invented. And later in life, he, reflecting back on his career, he said, I was an early proponent of the stethoscope, and essentially I was ridiculed by my profession, who were like, this is never going to catch on. Obviously he was correct and they weren't. But we have William Stokes' stethoscope, like his one with his little band with his name on, and the medics are fascinated by that. I think because he's such a sort of Goliath in their profession, to see the instrument that he used, I think is really special for them. For anyone who's been in the building, in the main hall, we have 4 life-size statues of 4 of our most famous 19th century presidents, including William Stokes. And we do occasionally get people coming in to see them. And a couple of summers ago, I had a few people who just turned up on spec and wanted to see Robert Graves' statue. And after the 3rd or 4th group, I was like, this is getting a bit odd. So I asked them and said, what's going on? There was a big conference, an international conference about thyroid disease on in Dublin, and Graves described Graves' disease, which is a thyroid condition. So all these international thyroid doctors were coming in because they wanted to see the statue of Graves. So, I guess there's some names that are internationally famous in Irish medicine. And so I guess that really appeals to the medics.
And that kind of leads into kind of naturally asking, like, when we look at Irish contribution to worldwide medicine, are there a couple of key breakthroughs or moments beyond what?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a period that in the sort of from about the 1820s through to the 1860s, which is kind of known as, it's been described as the golden age of Irish medicine. And there's this group of medics, Stokes, Graves, Corrigan, who I mentioned before, they're working in Dublin, they're working in the hospitals around Dublin, and they are making lots of discoveries. It is a time when there's lots of discoveries in medicine, but there just happens to be this very big concentration in Dublin. Graves and Stokes introduced clinical bedside teaching to Ireland. So in the end of the 17th, end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, if you were studying medicine, you would have been taught in Latin in a university. You wouldn't have seen any patients. You were taught the theory. Okay. Graves and Stokes took the students out of the lecture theatres into the wards, and they taught in English so that the students could talk to the patients and they could see the diseases. And introducing that, and particularly in the Meath Hospital where they both worked, it made Dublin a centre for medical education, and it meant that students from outside Ireland came to study in Dublin because it had such a good reputation. So for most of the 19th century, Ireland was producing far more doctors than it needed because people were coming here to study as well as Irish students. A lot of them then either went back to the UK and worked there, or took up options, essentially the opportunities either in the British Army or Navy, so a lot of travel, or in like British Empire posts, essentially. So a lot of Irish doctors worked kind of across the globe, really.
Okay, that's it's funny when you explain it like that, something like bedside teaching. It's such a simple but powerful way of actually revolutionizing how they teach and engage with students. But it does, it sounds like a formative moment. And I can't help but thinking about your collection in the context of the fact that all of us are currently living through a worldwide pandemic. It is kind of hard to avoid the subject. So I don't know, I kind of found myself wondering, do you have, or, you know, if we look back through history at some of the pandemics and kind of key moments of that sort, do we have much of a record and kind of a personal account of what those periods would have actually been like to experience?
No, so I mean, I guess the pandemic that has most often been compared to the current one is the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, and we have very few records, certainly very few contemporary records of the flu pandemic. So Kathleen Lynn does cover it in her diary. There's also quite a lot else going on in her life in that period. She's on the run for quite a lot of it. At one stage, she is actually released from prison on the Lord Mayor of Dublin asks for her to be released from prison to help treat the pandemic. So, you know, there are mentions of that, and she talks a lot about, you know, going to treat people who's ill, who's not. So it's in there. But that's the only first-hand account we have. We have an account written by a doctor about 40 years later, looking back on what it was like being a student during the flu pandemic. He was working in the Mater Hospital, and he says himself, you know, I'm looking back 40 years later, my recollections have become a little bit of a blur, and it's, you know, you can't remember individual events, but sort of more a general feeling of what it was like. And then also because we do have hospital records that cover that time, but obviously they were under such pressure that regular record keeping tends to break down because there's so much going on. You know, you can't be recording who's coming in and who's coming out when there's such high rates and, you know, the pressure on the system. And it is something that I've been really aware of with COVID is, you know, it is, I mean, it's a time that's going to be formative for everybody, but for medicine, it's a particularly important, you know, sort of, you know, for the generation of doctors who are working now, this is going to be probably the thing that defines their careers. And it's how to go about capturing that while it's happening, but then also not putting pressure on the doctors who are obviously and have been extremely busy. So we did put out a call last year for people in healthcare if they wanted to send in material, and we are still collecting. It was quite interesting. Initially, we got accounts written by doctors who'd been ill with COVID quite early on, and I found it really interesting that like a lot of the early accounts we got focused on that and what it was like to be a patient, and particularly almost the guilt they felt about being sick when they were needed, you know, for their own medical skills. And some of them were really quite ill, the accounts they sent in. We've had a lot of quite sort of, I guess, creative responses that doctors have written poetry, in one case a piece of music in response to COVID that they've sent to us. Worse, or, you know, putting more pressure on them and saying, you know, can you keep a diary while you're doing all this as well, please?
It does seem like quite a large kind of challenging thing in the context of that. And I actually kind of, within the kind of the world of pandemic and kind of, you know, medical responses to that, I was going through, and I must say your website is incredible in terms of the amount of information that is up there. But I was up there and I saw that you have a collection of cowpox institutions, which was a service set up around vaccine services.
Yeah, so it's the first vaccination Edward Jenner discovered, or well, he's credited with, there were lots of people working at the same time, but he gets the publicity. Vaccination for smallpox, which essentially was you were infected with cowpox, which is a milder version of smallpox. So he and several others had noticed that dairymaids particularly tended to not get smallpox because they got cowpox. Jenner's, I think he's the 1780s, he is the discovery made. By 1800, the Lord Lieutenant was writing to the president of the College of Physicians and Surgeons saying, right, how are we going to go about vaccinating in Ireland? And they set up the Cowpox Institute, which essentially was a mail order vaccine service. And they had a clinic on the north side of Dublin that you could go in and get your vaccination. And then doctors and also the Army and Navy could request them to send out vaccine to them that they could then administer. And so, yeah, it's quite extraordinary. Like it's such a simple, like we're so used to vaccination now, but it was completely revolutionary at the time. And Samuel Labatt, who was one of the doctors who ran the Cowpox Institution, he met Jenner and he he worked really hard to promote it, and he did a lot of things that we would do now to encourage vaccination. You know, he looked at and went, like, who are the people in society who are going to make a difference? And he went to the Catholic Church and said, will you support vaccination? Will you encourage people to go and get their vaccination? And they did. And, you know, it's the same thing we're doing now, isn't it? You want to get the influencers who are going to reassure people that it's safe to get the vaccination. You know, it's...
Yeah, and it's funny actually, because I saw that the one of the articles in the Irish Times there at the weekend, or certainly midweek, was saying that Ireland has one of the highest kind of levels of willingness to receive the COVID vaccination. I think it's 86.5% of Irish people are receptive to the idea. And I was kind of wondering if we've always had that kind of let's trust science attitude, or...
Ireland had very high smallpox vaccination rates. Well, initially they were sort of the same, but they did a very sensible thing when they introduced so you got your smallpox vaccination when you were quite young, and when they introduced the registration of births, they wrote to the local county doctors and said, do you want to be in charge of registering births? So essentially you brought your child in, you got their birth registered, and you got their smallpox vaccination, and you got it all done at once. It's a very clever way of doing it, and it meant that there were really high levels in Ireland because they made it easy.
Yeah, that makes, and I guess finding an administrative solution to the problem.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned earlier in the conversation Sir Patrick Dunne's hospital and its kind of importance in the life of the college.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about its life cycle.
So Patrick Dunne, he was born in Scotland. He studied medicine in Aberdeen, and then he came to Ireland. It's not quite clear when, but sometime in about the 1670s. He was a fellow. He became a fellow of the college, and he was president, I think, for the first time in about 1673. I can't remember quite the date, but quite early on. He fled Ireland in the end of the 1670s with a lot of other Protestants, and then came back as he was the medical officer to King William's armies in Ireland. And he was responsible for getting the college their second royal charter, because he had influence with the king, because he supported him through these campaigns. The 1692 charter names Patrick Dunne as the first president of the new college. You know, it's definitely him. When Dunne died in 1713, his only son had died before him, so he was childless, and he was quite wealthy by this stage. He left, as I mentioned, his library to the college, but he also left all his property in trust. And the income from that trust was to go to Lady Dunne, his widow, for her life or until she remarried, and then her death or remarriage was going to the college. Lady Dunne outlived Sir Patrick by nearly 30 years, I think, which greatly annoyed the college because we were constantly waiting to get our money. We had a slightly fractious relationship. Early on, it was fine, but I think as she lived on and the college itched to get the money. Dunne had intended that the college would use the money to set up a medical school, a teaching school in the College of Physicians. But when they actually received the money, they decided they would appoint professors to teach in Trinity College rather than having their own medical school. So they'd sort of centralize it in one place. So right up into the 1950s, there were the King's professors in Trinity who were appointed by the college and the College of Physicians and paid out of Dunne's estates. And then there were the Trinity professors as well. Dunne had intended to have one professorship. By the end of the 18th century, there was enough money for 4 professorships because he owned considerable estates in County Waterford, and they just got more and more income coming in from them. And then in 1800, it was decided that they would found a hospital from the estates as well. And it would be a hospital for sort of the common people of Dublin. It would be, you know, I guess we would see it as a non-fee paying hospital. You could just turn up and get treatment. But it would also be for clinical teaching. Okay. So the Trinity professor and the King's professors taught in Dunne's hospital once sort of bedside teaching had become established. And the hospital closed in the 1980s. So a lot of, I guess, people, I don't, but a lot of people do remember, like when we open for Heritage Week, we get a lot of people who come in who remember Dunne's hospital and, you know, were there previously. And the building is still owned by the HSE, and I believe that the registry office is in the former morgue of the hospital, which the doctors like to tell me that you can now get married in the morgue.
I would dare say there's a few couples out there that don't really want to know that fact. It's and actually to kind of, sorry, I don't know what you said there a moment ago, but something made me think of it. A kind of perhaps an unfair question to ask you, but when you look at your collection, what is the piece or the story that you personally find most fascinating?
I'm always asked this. So I'm always it's like choosing your favorite child, isn't it?
I know.
Favorite thing in the collection.
Sorry.
So if I do have to choose one item, and it's a very personal one, so Dr. Kirkpatrick, who I mentioned before, he was registrar of the college for 40 years. Like the vast majority of the collection, I wouldn't have a job without him. Like he collected for the college. The 40 years he's in charge, there's meticulous record keeping for the college. He should have been an archivist. He published lots on the history of medicine, a huge amount of work. When he died, he left his own personal archive and his collection of books to the college. And when I was sorting out his archive, as well as all his medical papers, there's one notebook in which he's done some family history research. And I found out from that he and I are related. So we're something like 5th cousins 4 times removed. So that is my personal favorite piece, because it's a connection for me with someone who, I think has done a huge amount. Like I say, I wouldn't have a job without him. There wouldn't be the collection we have without his work. So
Wow.
For me, that's a very personal connection. But
yeah, both a personal and professional.
Yeah.
What a gorgeous story. That must have been a surreal moment the day you discovered that. Really, really, wow. That's a Goosebumps moment. That's wonderful. And like, because I think it is, I think what we as kind of, not even anyone specific to the industry, but I think what people are always fascinated by is the human element, and actually getting past the superficial story and getting into the
I think so. And I think with medicine particularly, like everyone's been to see a doctor, like everyone's interacted in some way with medicine. So our collection, the biggest weakness I would say of our collection is that we don't have very much the patient voice. It tends to be it's the doctor's view of medicine. And if the patients are in there, it's the doctor writing about them rather than the patient talking about their experience. But what I have started to do now is when we're given items for the collection, I'll always ask if we can have a photograph of the doctor it belonged to, because then when you display it, you've got a whole story to go behind it. And 4 or 5 years ago, we did an exhibition on called Out of the Doctor's Bag, which was about the evolution of the doctor's bag and what went into it. And we did it with the retired group of general practitioners. And as far as we could, we displayed pictures of the doctors next to the instruments. And we had a photograph of one doctor from I think he was still practicing into the 60s. And we had feedback forms for exhibitions. And we got lots of really lovely comments from people who remembered him and he was their doctor. Or his receptionist, very, very popular. But it was great because his widow was still alive. So we were able to give her this feedback and say, look, there's lots of people who remember your husband really fondly. So, it's putting the personal story into it. And rather than that, like, this is just a stethoscope and this is a doctor's bag, this is where they were used, it was this doctor who looked after this community. And then suddenly we were getting people telling us that they remembered this doctor and,
Yeah, but in a lot of instances, they are relationships that we carry over a large number of years. So I guess kind of we, the public, do end up having important, meaningful relationships with doctors. And I kind of, through your collection, you're looking at the human, and the putting a face to a name idea, I think, is just such an explicit and kind of visual way of actually helping to build those connections. But in looking through your collection, you're also able to chart some of the kind of the larger world events that are going on around us. I remember seeing on your website that you have a number of accounts from medical officers or kind of major generals who were involved in the First and Second World War.
Yeah.
So we're actually able to look at getting some insight into those sorts of world events from their perspective.
Yeah, it's he's another O'Meara. I think he is related to Barry O'Meara, who was Napoleon's doctor, but he is an Irish doctor. He trained in Trinity, and he joined the British Army and was captured in France in 1940 and spent quite a lot of the next 3 years in a German prisoner of war camp. And we have very vivid accounts written by him of what it was like, not particularly being in the camps, but particularly about the way other nationalities were treated. So that the British, he was saying, the British were tended to be treated better than particularly the Russian prisoners. He said were very badly treated, and pretty much says that they were sent to do things that would result in them becoming ill. So there's kind of his accounts, and we'd shared those accounts online because our catalogues are all online so people can find them. And I was contacted out of the blue by a lady from France whose father was a French dentist and had been in the same prisoner of war camp with O'Mara, and she had stories from her father that she knew about him, and she then sent me an account of her recollections. I think it written by her father before he died, about his recollections of being in the camp with O'Mara, and they got on really well because they were both Catholics. So they, like, although everyone assumed he was English because he spoke English, so they didn't really sort of. But the Catholicism was a thing that allowed them to kind of really bond. Or they didn't. I don't think O'Mara spoke French at that stage. But it's those connections and being able to share things online. Like, she would never have found us otherwise. And it just gives the whole sort of other side to the picture of like what's happening.
And it's funny, even just from kind of an oral history and a memory collection perspective, like I think it'll be really interesting to see what the last 12 months is going to do for the future of archive and memory collection.
Yeah, I think every archive is trying to work out how to collect and then how not to all collect the same thing. I think whereas the 1918-19 flu pandemic, there's very little information. I think there's the risk that future historians may just be overwhelmed by the quantity of material.
But it'll be the caliber of cataloguing.
Yeah, it's how to work out what and particularly like the, I guess, born digital material like social media, all of those things, like how to capture that in a way that can still be looked at in. I've been offered a WhatsApp group to archive, and I genuinely don't know how to archive that.
Oh, that is a surreal conversation, I'd imagine. Yeah, we really very nearly found ourselves launching a kind of a COVID in Dublin, memory project, and then kind of realized, it's, you have to identify what your story is and what you're trying to tell. And it is, as you said, kind of, there is the scope for memory overload potentially. But then kind of in talking about the fact that, say, there's very few records when we look back at the Spanish flu, but there will be a bombardment of information from today. Like, within your collection, you do have, I think was it Sir William John Thompson speaks a lot about statistics and kind of population metrics and kind of, looking at mortality and disease rates over time. Like, how is information like that, in what ways are contemporary researchers engaging? Are they people within the medical profession? Is it arts and cultures and humanities?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix. So there are a lot of largely retired medics, because they have a bit more time, who tend to be quite interested in the history of particularly their specialty within medicine. Then there's I guess, like, the social history of medicine and social and cultural history has really kind of opened up the collection to new areas. So UCD run a course in history of medicine, so we would get a lot of researchers from there. Trinity, there's quite a few come in as well. So there's, I guess, and they're coming at it from a very different angle almost. Like the way they're researching and what they're looking for is different, and how they're, they could both approach the same material and come with very different sort of findings from, which is quite interesting itself. And we do get a lot of people doing family history and with the collections as well, because if you have an Irish doctor in your family, we're likely to have information on where they trained and worked and studied and stuff. So we do that as well. And then, like, we get, like, the NCAD, I work with them, and they do an optional module for, I think, their first year students who come in and look at the art of anatomy, and they come in and, like, look at the really large folio printed books we have with anatomical drawings in, and we have some hand-drawn anatomical stuff as well, so they kind of look at that. So there's all sorts of kind of routes into the collection that you wouldn't necessarily kind of expect. And I always find it really interesting. There's certain things, like Lynn's diaries are by far and away the most consulted item in our collection. But people come in and want to look at all sorts of things, and it's really not, sometimes quite eclectic range of material. I get the request and thinking, oh, never put those together, but that's
it's kind of part of the fun of it, I'd imagine. Really. And so, I think kind of a key a key narrative, that we hear talked about a lot in society is this, you can't be what you can't see type concept, that is kind of is spoken about in kind of women's roles within society in more recent times. Like, if we're looking at the younger generation and looking at kids today and trying to help inspire them to see, the potential of what they can do and what they can achieve, and if we're looking at role models, what are the couple of stories that you've come across in your collection that you've just really thought, there's an amazing person just doing good work?
I mean, there's a lot of them, and I think the women's thing is a real issue. So although we were the first college to admit women, kind of went downhill from there. So we didn't admit our first female fellow until the 1920s, and Mary Horgan, who I'm sure a lot of people will have seen, she's on Neffet and on the telly all the time, is our current president, but she is our first female president in 350 or 60 years. So it has taken quite a long time for that to come through. I do have to say she hates being referred to as the first female president. She is also our first Kerry-born president, which she is much prouder of. But I think Lynn did do a lot, and but she has had a lot of publicity perhaps, and I think sometimes there are the whole group of women who worked in St Albans Hospital are quite extraordinary. So Dorothy Stopford Price, who did the research that led to the introduction of the BCG vaccination into Ireland, really important, saved thousands of lives. Ella Webb, who also works in there, who started off as an anaesthetist and ended up founding the Sunshine Homes to provide relief for families and childcare. Lots of really inspiring women. Like our first female fellow, so she became Mary Hearn was her name. She was made a fellow in 1924, I think is the date. She was studying medicine. She left medicine to get married. Her husband eventually ended up a Bishop of Cork. She had 2 children, but she went back into medicine and she practiced as a GP. And to do all that now is quite phenomenal. But to do that in the 1920s, and obviously with the support of her husband, so I think there are lots of stories like that perhaps do get lost under the really big names.
And I guess it comes down to this idea of coming back to the human. I can't remember who said it. I think it was the interview we did with Gabriel Byrne a couple of months ago, but it was this idea of embracing the spectacular every day. Just picking those moments, and they're usually the ones worth celebrating. And so, kind of museums, kind of collections, archives, spaces like where we kind of coexist are very slowly and very cautiously reopening within the kind of government guidelines over the last couple of months and the next couple of months, hopefully. So as things continue to open up, on behalf of the college, what are you either hungry to achieve or looking forward to?
I think like our collections are great and they're lovely. I know our building is the showstopper. We opened for Culture Night. We didn't last year, but we did videos for. It was actually really good. So last year, instead of opening the doors for Culture Night, I asked some of the fellows to come in and do a little video about what they liked about the building, because we tend not to ask them that. It tends to be like I show people around, but actually, for the doctors, there's a real strong connection to them, to the building. Some of them almost a horror because they sat their exams in the building and can't quite get over that. They no longer sit exams in our building, so we don't have that problem with the younger doctors. But I'd love to open for Culture Night. We are hoping to open for Culture Night. We might not be able to throw open the doors in quite the way we have in the past, but at least be able to let some people in. We have reopened for researchers since May, which has been lovely. My first researcher in May was also the last researcher I had in March the year before, which was really nice. He'd been waiting a very long time to get back to his book. And we have plans to try and expand the public access to the collections, because the building is used by the college for our own events. It's hired out for external events, so it's not always easy for the public to get in outside of things like Culture Night and Heritage Week. And although we do have a small exhibition area, it's kind of in the middle of the building, so it can be quite hard for people to get there. So there are plans, probably, I guess, in the longer term, to try and have a more publicly accessible space within the building where people can come in and engage with the collections without having to make an appointment, and to, I guess, really open them up. I think that's a big thing change for the college in the last 20 years is they've always valued their own history, but I don't think they realised that lots of other people were interested in it as well.
Oh, I
remember the first culture night when I opened the door and I sort of tentatively said, I think we might have quite a lot of people in. And everyone's like, oh, I don't know. I was like, maybe 1,000. And they were like, oh, you wouldn't get that many. We had nearly 2,000. And the then president of the college popped in just to sort of see how things were going. And he just stood in the middle of the gravestone and went, but there's so many, I've never seen so many people in the building. And it was great. He was delighted by it, but it was just, they hadn't realized that there was this hunger to come in and see it. And I think opening that up is, I think one of the things I think has been most successful in my time in the college is to get them to realize that it's important for them and their history, but it's everybody's history, and everyone should, and they're delighted that people want to come in. I don't think it was that they wanted to stop people before, they just didn't realize that there was an interest. And
that's an amazing contribution to be making to the organization and to the wider public.
Yeah,
it really, really is. And it's I sincerely hope that Culture Night, if memory serves, the 17th September this year.
I have just tentatively put in what we're planning to do.
Yeah, it's it'll be the night of our 10th birthday.
Oh, very good.
Theme. So I'm hoping there will be a party. There will be Rice Krispie cakes and bunting, which is in my head what a good 10-year-old birthday party entails.
That is absolutely, and a bouncy castle maybe.
I dare say the insurers will say no to that one.
Possibly.
But I see a couple of people writing in. One of our guests is saying she has such fond memories of a Culture Night tour and saying thank you very much for making that possible. And then Jerry, another guest, is writing in saying, Harriet, it really is so interesting to listen to you. You're an absolute joy. And this has been such an articulate opportunity to get some insight into an area that I knew nothing about. So thank you so much. So that brings us to 7 o'clock on the button. Harriet, this has been absolutely fascinating. I still have 1,000,001 questions, so I would dare say the next time the building is open, I'll be the first one standing in line to get the tour. So
that'd be lovely.
Sincerely, I will look forward to that day. But to everyone who's joined us here this evening, thank you so much for being here. And to Harriet Wheelock, the Keeper of Collections at the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, it's been really wonderful having you. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
So good evening, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye.